Hey there, Jeep Divers. Ready to get our hands dirty with some literary theory.
By dirty, you mean fascinating, right?
Well, I was going for hands-on, but
Yeah.
fascinating works too. We're digging into Party1.pdf today, and it's all about narratology.
Narratology. It's like the secret code book for unlocking how stories really work.
Okay, see, code book sounds a little intimidating. I'm picturing, like, dusty old textbooks and complicated diagrams.
I get it, but trust me, it's not as scary as it sounds. Think of it this way. Ever wonder how an author can make you feel like you're living in a story, even though it's just words on a page? Narratology helps us understand those tricks of the trade.
Okay, that piques my interest. But to be honest, I always thought overanalyzing stories kind of ruins the magic. Like, isn't it better just to let yourself get swept away?
That's a common worry. But Party1.pdf argues that understanding narratology can actually make us appreciate stories even more. It's like realizing how much skill and artistry goes into creating something that seems effortless.
All right, you've got me thinking. So what is narratology exactly?
Well, to put it simply, it's the study of how stories are told. Just like linguistics explores the structure of language, narratology looks at the underlying systems and patterns that make narratives tick.
So instead of getting bogged down in plot details, we're looking at the bigger picture, the how and why of storytelling.
Exactly. And a key figure in narratology is Genette. He's the one who really gave us a framework for breaking down a story into its core elements.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me the Genette breakdown.
Well, Genette says there are three main layers to every story. First, you have the story, and that's the most straightforward part. It's just the events themselves in chronological order.
So kind of like a timeline of what happened.
Precisely. The story is just the bare bones, the raw material, but of course there's so much more to it than that, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking if that's all there was to it, every story would be pretty boring. So what's next?
The next layer is the narrative, and this is where things get really interesting. It's how the story is told, the language, the style, the structure the author uses.
So two authors could tell the same basic story, but their narratives could be wildly different.
You got it. Think about it. One author might tell the story in a very straightforward way, like a news report. Another might use flashbacks, stream of consciousness, multiple perspectives.
Right. Same events, completely different reading experience. Okay, this is blowing my mind a little. So we've got story, what happens, and narrative, how it's told. What's the third piece of the puzzle?
The third layer is the narration, and this is all about who's doing the telling. Is it a character in the story or some kind of outside voice? Are they reliable, or should we be questioning everything they tell us?
Oh, so this is where we get into things like first-person versus third-person narration.
Exactly. But Genette goes way deeper than that, exploring all the subtle ways an author's choice of narrator shapes our experience of the story.
All right, I can already tell this narration thing is a rabbit hole we're going to have to explore further.
So we're back in that rabbit hole, ready to talk about narration. Remember, it's not just who tells the story, but their whole relationship to the story that makes a difference.
Okay, yeah, and I remember you mentioning some pretty intense terminology Genette uses to describe that relationship, something like homodiegetic and heterodiegetic.
Yeah, those words can seem a little daunting at first, but they actually describe pretty straightforward concepts.
Okay, well then, enlighten me. What's the difference?
All right, so a homodiegetic narrator is essentially a character who's part of the story they're telling. We see everything through their eyes, experience the events alongside them.
Okay, so like if a character's telling this story directly to us using I, that's homodiegetic.
You got it. It's like we're getting a first-hand account right from the source.
And it instantly creates that intimacy, right? Like we're practically best friends with the narrator,
Yeah.
privy to their innermost thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. But, of course, there's a trade-off. With that closeness comes limited perspective. We only see the story through that one character's eyes with all their biases and blind spots.
Right, right. So that's where heterodiegetic comes in.
Precisely. A heterodiegetic narrator is outside the story, not a participant in the events. Think of it like an observer or maybe even a storyteller who's piecing together events they didn't personally experience.
So more like, say, the narrator in a history book or documentary.
Perfect examples. They might have deep knowledge of the events, but they aren't directly involved in the action.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's kind of like choosing between two different camera angles for your story, right? Close up and personal, or a wider, more panoramic view.
That's a great way to put it. And each choice comes with its own set of strengths and limitations. A homodiegetic narrator can create incredible emotional immediacy, but a heterodiegetic narrator can offer a broader, more objective perspective.
Fascinating. It makes you realize how much thought goes into choosing the right type of narrator for a story. But hold on, there's more, right? Doesn't Genette also talk about something called focalization? What is that exactly?
You're right, we can't forget about focalization. It's another layer of complexity, but a really important one. While voice tells us who's speaking, focalization tells us whose eyes we see the story through.
Whose eyes we see the story through. Okay, I think I'm going to need an example for this one.
Of course, imagine a story about a queen and a peasant. We might hear the story from an outside narrator, but at times, the narrative might zoom in on the queen's thoughts and feelings, showing us the world through her eyes. At other times, we might experience the story through the peasant's perspective, feeling their struggles and hopes.
So even though we have this outside narrator, our emotional and experiential understanding of the story shifts depending on whose perspective is being focalized.
Exactly. Focalization adds so much depth and nuance, even if we aren't consciously aware of it happening. And the really interesting thing is, focalization can shift within a story, even within a single scene.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. So what you're saying is, even if we have an omniscient, all-knowing narrator, the way they focus our attention, whose perspective they prioritize, can dramatically shape how we experience the story.
You've got it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Genette's work goes even deeper, exploring things like how time is manipulated in narratives.
So we ended last time on this cliffhanger, talking about how Genette dives into the way authors mess with time in storytelling.
Right. We were about to tackle analepsis and prolepsis, but those are really just fancy terms for tools that authors have been using forever.
Okay, good, because I was starting to feel like I needed a PhD in literary theory just to follow along. So analepsis is?
A flashback. You know those moments where the story jumps back in time to show us something that happened earlier? It's a classic way to reveal a character's backstory, or to fill in crucial information that sheds new light on the present.
Right, like when a character suddenly remembers a key event from their childhood that explains their current motivations.
Exactly. It adds a whole other layer to the story, deepens our understanding of the characters and their choices.
Okay, so if analepsis is a flashback, then prolepsis must be.
A flash forward. It's like the
Mhm.
author's giving us a sneak peek into the future of the story.
Which could be super effective for creating suspense, right? Like, we might see a character making a seemingly harmless choice, but then there's this flash forward to some terrible consequence,
Yeah,
and we're left on the edge of our seats wondering how they're going to get from point A to point B.
exactly. It's a great way to keep readers guessing, to create a sense of anticipation or dread. And what's fascinating is that both analepsis and prolepsis mess with our sense of time in a story.
It's like the author's playing with our expectations, right? Because in real life, we experience time linearly, but in stories, anything goes.
Precisely. And Genette gives us a language for talking about those choices, for understanding how they impact our experience of the narrative.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for thinking about stories, for appreciating the craft that goes into them.
That's what narratology is all about. It's not about ruining the magic of stories, but about witnessing our appreciation for that magic, for the choices that authors make to create their effects.
It's not just for academics, right? Anyone can benefit from thinking about these things.
Absolutely. Next time you're reading a book, watching a movie, or even just listening to a friend tell a story, pay attention to the who, the how, and the when of the narration. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Great advice. Big thanks to you, expert, for taking us on this deep dive into the world of narratology, and to party1.pdf for being our guide.
My pleasure. It's been a fascinating conversation.
And to our listeners, until next time, happy reading. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into the nitty-gritty of how stories really work. You know, like, not just what happens, but the whole who's talking to who thing.
Yeah.
Narratology, right?
It's like stories have their own secret language, and we're going to crack the code.
Yeah,
Get ready for some mind-blowing stuff.
totally. Ever read a book and it feels like the author knows you better than you know yourself?
Yeah.
Like, how did they do that?
Well, if they're using this whole communication model, sort of a blueprint of how a story connects with us, we've got the author, obviously the one with the pen.
But then there's this other author, the implied one. It's like the author's personality on the page.
Yeah. Like, think about authors who use pen names. They're creating a whole different author for us to imagine.
So it's not Stephen King I'm picturing while reading IT.
Ah.
It's this, like, shadowy, scary storyteller version of him.
Exactly. And then there's the narrator, which, whoa, can be a whole other thing entirely.
Mhm.
Remember those books told from a kid's point of view? The narrator shapes everything.
Oh, man. Like that one where you think it's a ghost story, but the kid just misunderstood what was going on. So good.
See, that's the narrator's power. Now, on the reader side, same deal. We've got doubles. There's you, the actual human listening right now.
And then this other me the author had in mind while writing.
Bingo. The implied reader. Like, an author writing about, I don't know, medieval knights probably assumes their reader knows what a joust is.
So that's why some books just click. It's like the author gets me, or at least the version of me they wrote this for.
And when it's a mismatch, you get those did the author really just moments. All about assumptions and how we communicate, even in stories.
Mind blown already.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got authors and readers, both the real deal and the implied versions. But what about the narrator? They seem pretty crucial.
Oh, absolutely. And here's where it gets juicy. The narrator, even when it's I on the page, is never actually the author.
Wait, hold up. Even with first person. Explain this like on 5.
Okay, imagine a puppet show. You hear the puppet talking, but there's a person behind it, right, making it happen. The narrator's like that puppet, a character the author made to tell the story.
So it's a choice. Like the author's using the narrator as a tool to get the story across in a specific way. That's kind of sneaky.
More like strategy. Choosing the right narrator changes everything. Think about those narrators who are, shall we say, a little unreliable.
Oh, you mean the ones who are either clueless or straight up lying to us?
Yeah.
The worst. But also the best.
Exactly. And spotting them is half the fun because then you're like, wait, can I trust anything this narrator says?
It's like real life. You got to watch out for people with agendas.
Right. And that's where knowing the difference between the real author, the implied author, and the narrator is key. It's like a puzzle who's really pulling the strings here.
This is making my brain work in a good way.
Yeah.
Okay, so where does this narrating thing fit in? Sounds spooky.
Less spooky, more like, imagine the narrator's having a conversation. The narrator is who they think they're talking to, their audience within the story.
Oh, like those old books where the narrator's all, "Dear reader," they're straight up acknowledging someone's listening.
Yeah, that's one type. But sometimes it's more subtle, just assumed, like an actor on stage. They know there's an audience, even if they don't break the fourth wall.
So even if they're not saying, "Hey, you," the narrator still has an idea of who might be hearing their tale.
Exactly. And that assumed audience can be super revealing. It's like a hidden clue to what the author wants us to think or feel.
Okay, so this narrating, like the phantom audience, how does that actually change things for me, the real-life reader?
Think about it like this. You pick up a historical novel, right?
Right.
Maybe it's about, I don't know, the Russian Revolution. The author might not explain who Lenin is. They just assume you know.
So if I flunked history, I'm going to be lost. But if I do get the reference, it's like this little inside joke.
Exactly. Creates connection. But it can also be tricky. Like, what if the author assumes everyone reading shares their views on, say, politics?
Ooh, yeah, good point. A book that's all preachy and assumes I agree, that's going to shut me down fast.
Right. Being aware of that effaced narrative, the one the author imagined, it's huge, both for enjoying a book and for writing one that connects.
It's like meta reading or something.
Yeah.
Learning about how to learn from stories, it's wild. Speaking of connections, what about this intertextuality thing? Sounds like books are gossiping about each other.
Kinda. It's the idea that stories don't just exist on their own. They reference, they riff on, they adapt, like all those modern takes on Shakespeare.
Oh, yeah, like Romeo and Juliet, but make it a teen rom-com. Or like set in space. They're using the same bones, but making something new.
Exactly. And knowing the original, it adds this whole other layer. Like, they're doing that with the story now. Clever.
Makes me want to reread my whole library with fresh eyes. Okay, so authors, narrators, narratees, even the stories themselves are chatting. Anything else we got to factor in?
Well, the text really emphasizes how crucial all this is when we're dealing with, you guessed it, those unreliable narrators.
So it's not just spotting the lies, it's figuring out why they're lying or what the author's trying to say by using that voice.
Exactly. Think of The Great Gatsby. The whole story is from Nick's point of view, but he's totally smitten with Gatsby, even when Gatsby's being shady.
Right, like Nick's blinded by the glitz and glamour, missing what's really going on.
So understanding Nick's limitations as a narrator, that's key to understanding the whole book's message about the American dream.
Wow. So we're not just passively reading, we're like story detectives, trying to figure out the truth behind the narrator's spin.
And that's where it gets fun. Makes you think critically, question everything.
I'm into it. Okay, but the text also talks about how even simple stuff, like how an idea is explained, that can be a clue about the narrative.
Totally. It's like, When a narrator explains something directly to you, the reader, they're making assumptions about what you already know.
So a sci-fi novel that explains every detail of how a spaceship works, maybe that author's picturing a reader who's new to the genre.
Right. Or the opposite, if they breeze past it, they figure you've read your share of spaceships.
Like a silent conversation, the author's anticipating my questions. Which, okay, how did that work with an unreliable narrator?
Ooh, good one. Imagine a mystery novel. The detectives explaining their deductions. But are they being totally honest with the reader, or is this part of the game?
Oh, I see. The explanation itself could be a manipulation, a way to throw us off the scent.
Exactly. The text even talks about how explanations can be used for humor, irony, even to totally flip our
Okay,
expectations.
my mind is officially blown.
Oh,
Like, even the most basic parts of a story have these hidden depths when you look at them this way.
and that's the beauty of narratology. It gives us these new tools to appreciate how stories work, not to take away the magic, but to add to it.
Totally agree. Okay, so we've covered a ton. Authors, narrators, narratees, even stories themselves having a little chat. But there's this whole other thing, this classification system, like homodiegetic versus heterodiegetic. It's a mouthful, but kind of cool. Break it down for me.
Happy to. These terms might sound intimidating, but they're super useful. Basically, it's about whether the narrator is a character in the story or not. Homodiegetic, they're in the mix.
So, like Holden Caulfield, he's telling a story, he's a homo, whatever it is, narrator.
Nailed it. He's living those events. Now, heterodiegetic is outside, more like that voiceover in a documentary.
So, like the narrator in Pride and Prejudice, they're giving us the gossip, but they're not in the story.
Exactly. And then it gets even more specific. An autodiegetic narrator. That's like Holden. They're not just a character, they're the main character.
So double points for Holden. Why does that distinction matter, though?
Because it's all about subjectivity. When the narrator is the protagonist, their experience is, well, their experience.
Right, full of their own biases and baggage.
Exactly. Now, on the narrative side, we've got similar categories. Intradiegetic versus extradiegetic. Basically, whether they exist within the story's world or outside it.
Okay, give me an example. My brain's starting to fry a little. What's an intradiegetic narrative?
Imagine a story where one character is telling another character a story. The one listening. That's your intradiegetic narrative part of the story, but also receiving a story within it.
Oh, like those Russian nesting doll stories, layers upon layers.
Exactly. And then extradiegetic, that's us, the actual readers, hanging out here in the real world.
Right, but what about those times when the narrator's like, hey, reader, you seeing this? Doesn't that mess things up?
Great point. Those are tricky. The text calls that the invoked narrative.
So they're acknowledging there's a reader out here beyond the page.
Totally. It's like breaking the fourth wall, a direct line to us.
I love those moments. Makes it feel more real somehow, even though it's fiction.
Right. Adds that extra layer. Makes us think about the whole act of storytelling. Who's in control? Who's just along for the ride?
Okay, I'm starting to see how these different types of narrators and narrates, they really change up the whole reading game. Like the author's picking the right tool for the job, thinking about who they want to reach.
And those tools can be super subtle. The text even talks about how authors can, play tricks with our expectations of the invoked narrative. Like, imagine a magician with a deck of cards, but it's words.
Okay, now you have to explain that. What kind of tricks are we talking about?
Well, there's this example from a 17th century French novelist, Scarron, and he actually talked about different types of readers, like benevolent ones, and get this, malevolent ones.
Wait, he called out mean readers in his book? That's amazing. I kind of love it.
It's more like he knew not everyone would be into his style. Some people are looking for reasons to hate a book. Others just want to see where the story goes. He got that.
So he was already thinking about how different people read way back then. That's kind of wild.
Totally. Shows real awareness, right? Like reading isn't just one-sided, but the text also warns that this whole invoked narrative thing, it can get a little messy.
Messy how?
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got me worried.
Well, sometimes the line between that invoked narrative, the one we imagine being spoken to, and a character who's actually being told the story within the story, it gets blurry.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to need an example. My brain's not built for this many layers?
So the text talks about Louis Ferdinand Céline, another French writer. Super unique style. Apparently, his narrators, They could be real jerks to their narratees, like insults, the whole 9 yards.
Whoa, not exactly a friendly welcome to the story vibe, huh?
Not even close, more like the narrator's picking a fight with whoever's reading.
Okay, that's intense. Why would an author do that?
Million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Literary critics are still arguing about it, but narratology-wise, the text says it messes with who we think is being addressed. Is it me, the reader? Or is it like the narrator suddenly giving life to some other character by yelling at them?
So the invoked narrative, the one who's usually just implied, they get thrown a curveball, become almost real.
You got it. The whole power dynamic shifts. Suddenly I'm not just reading, I'm like taking cover.
Okay, I gotta say, this whole deep dive, it's been intense. Like, I read all the time, but I never thought about all this stuff going on beneath the surface.
Right, and that's what's so cool about narratology. It doesn't ruin the fun, it just shows you how the trick is done.
Totally. It's like knowing how a watch works makes you appreciate the craftsmanship even more.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe now you'll spot these little narrative tricks in other books. Start noticing how the author's guiding your attention, the silent agreement between the voice telling the story and the one they think is listening.
I'm already planning my next library trip. Thanks for opening my eyes to all this.
Anytime, just remember, the next time you pick up a book, you're not just reading a story. You're entering into this whole intricate dance of communication and knowing the steps. That's what makes it truly amazing.
So well said. Until next time, everyone, happy reading. And remember, there's always more to discover if you know where to look. All right, everybody, ready to dive in. Today, we're going to be peeling back the layers of stories, like who's telling them and how.
We all love a good story, but today we'll be looking at them with new eyes, using Gerard Genette's work as our guide, especially his book, Narrative Discourse.
So, like, instead of just getting swept up in the plot, we can appreciate how it's all put together.
Yeah, it's like we're getting this X-ray vision to see the skeleton of any story.
I like that. So where do we start?
Well, every story's got to have its own world, right?
Yeah.
Genette calls this the diegesis. It's a term borrowed from film theory.
Okay, so like in Jurassic Park, the diegesis would be that island, right? With all the dinosaurs running around.
Exactly. Now, anything that exists outside of that island, outside the world of the story, that's extra diegetic. Like Steven Spielberg, the director, he's extra diegetic.
We're like us right now talking about it.
Exactly. We're extra diegetic too. But the dinosaurs, the characters, that Jeep chase, that's all intradiegetic. It's all happening within that specific story world.
Got it. Intradiegetic is inside the world. So we've got stuff outside the story, stuff inside the story. Is there more? Because, like, stories can have stories inside them, too.
You're one step ahead, and that's where the metadiegetic level comes in, those stories within stories. Think 1001 Nights.
Scheherazade telling all those stories to the Sultan so she doesn't get,
Right. So Scheherazade herself is part of that frame story that's intradiegetic. But the tale she tells, like about Sinbad.
Those are metadiegetic.
Exactly, a story within a story.
Okay, my brain's doing backflips trying to keep this all straight. We've got these layers, these levels. So how does this all fit into Genette's big idea?
So Genette's big thing is that each of these layers, extradiegetic, intradiegetic, metadiegetic, exists on its own narrative level. And these levels are built upon each other, creating this kind of hierarchy within a story.
It's like levels in a building, each built upon the one below it.
You got it. And the best way to understand this is by looking at an example. Genette uses the novel Manon Lescaut to really break this down.
Okay, so walk us through it. What makes Manon Lescaut such a good example of this?
Well, at the top level, the most outside layer, you have the author of Manon Lescaut, this guy who calls himself Monsieur de Renoncourt.
But isn't he like a fictional author?
Exactly. He claims to be writing his memoirs, but since he's fictional, that puts him on the extra-diegetic level, just like us discussing the book right now.
Okay, so he's fictional, but he's still outside the main story he's telling because he's the one telling it.
Right. Now, inside Manon Lescaut, the story itself, you have the main character, Des Grieux. He's totally intradiegetic, right? He's part of the world described in the memoirs.
Okay, makes sense so far. So where's that extra layer, that story within a story?
Here's the thing, Des Grieux, he tells a story within the main story, his own version of his love affair with this woman, Manon.
So that story, Des Grieux's love story, that's down on the metadiegetic level then.
Boom, you got it. That level is embedded within the larger narrative of the memoirs. It's like a story inside a story inside a story.
Wow. Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but it's kind of trippy.
It is, right. But that's the beauty of this whole concept. It's not just about what happens in a story, it's about who's telling it and from where.
So it's like there are these different voices, different levels of reality almost.
Yeah, and it's not just about real life versus fiction. We're talking about different voices the author creates within the text itself. Genette calls these textual instances.
Okay, textual instances. Say more about that. I'm not sure I totally get it.
Okay, so that fictional author we talked about, Monsieur Delacour, he exists on the same level as us, the real readers, even though he's, made up by the author.
That's wild. So, like, we're on the same level as this fictional character who's also writing a fictional story.
Exactly. But here's the other side of that coin. If a real historical figure pops up in a story, are they on our level?
Hmm, good point.
Hmm.
Even though they were real, within the story, they're just part of that fictional world.
Right. Like Napoleon in War and Peace. He was real, but in the novel, he's just another character. He interacts with the fictional character, so he's on their level, the intradiegetic level.
So it's not about if they were real in our world, but where they exist in the story's world in those different levels.
You got it. It's all about where the author places them in that hierarchy of narrative. And you know what happens when authors start to play with these levels? Like, really mess with them on purpose.
Oh, now you've got me intrigued. What happens? Give me the good stuff.
Well, get ready for metalepsis. That's when those neat narrative levels we talked about, they get totally turned upside down.
Metalepsis. Okay, that sounds serious. Is that where we get stuff like breaking the fourth wall?
Oh, you're good.
Mm.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing. It's when those levels get all mixed up in surprising ways, like the narrator suddenly talking directly to the reader. You ever see that?
Oh, yeah, or like in a movie when a character looks right at the camera.
Exactly. It's like the author's winking at us, right? Saying, we both know this is a story, so let's just have some fun with it.
Okay, I need an example. I'm a very show-me kind of person.
All right, well, Genette talks about this great example in Balzac. In his novel, The Old Maid, there's this scene where the narrator is describing a house, right? And he just comes right out and says, now let's enter this old maid's house together.
Well, hold on. It's like he's inviting us, the readers, to walk right into the story.
Exactly. That line between us, the audience, and the world of the story, it gets all blurry. Suddenly we're not just observing anymore. It's like we're becoming characters ourselves.
It's like those moments I was talking about when a character looks right at the camera. You're not sure if you should laugh or be totally freaked out.
And it can get even wilder than that. Have you ever read Continuity of Parks by Julio Cortázar?
Can't say that I have. What's that one about?
Oh, man, it's a trip. It's hard to explain, but basically you have a character in a book within the story, and he ends up committing a murder in the real world.
Wait, hold up. How is that even possible?
Right. That's Cortázar for you. That's metalepsis taken to the extreme. Those Russian dolls we talked about, those narrative levels, all of a sudden they're all messed up. Events on one level, they're bleeding into the other levels.
Okay, that's some next level storytelling right there. It makes you realize, like, we take these levels for granted. Usually we just get lost in a story. We don't think about how it's all put together.
Right. Most of the time, we're not even aware of these levels. But when you understand them, it's like this whole other dimension opens up. You start to see how authors play with these levels on purpose for different effects.
So we've got these different narrative levels all nested inside each other. Sometimes they even get all blended together, especially with stuff like metalepsis. It's a lot to keep track of. But it's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is. And I think the big question here is, why does any of this even matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why should we care about these levels?
Well, for one thing, it shows just how much goes into a good story. Like, we usually take it for granted, but there's so much going on beneath the surface.
It's like we're not just along for the ride anymore. We're like noticing all the little details, all the work that went into building this whole world.
And when you understand these levels, you start to notice things you never would have before. It's like you're more in tune with the author's intentions, you know? You get those subtle little hints, those winks to the reader. It's like you're sharing a secret language.
It's like having a decoder ring for books. I love that.
Yeah.
So if our listeners could only remember one thing about narrative levels, what would you want it to be?
That's a tough one. But I think what fascinates me the most is how these levels, even though they're separate, they're constantly talking to each other. They're always playing off each other. And that's where the real magic of storytelling happens.
So it's not about keeping them all straight in these neat little boxes. It's more about seeing how they work together.
Yes, exactly. These levels, they remind us that storytelling is a construction. It's something an author builds. And once we understand those building blocks, we can appreciate the whole thing on a deeper level.
Yeah, it's like before, I was just along for the ride. Now I feel like I'm really thinking about the story, the choices the author made.
And that changes everything, right? It's not just about getting lost in the story anymore. It's about appreciating how it's all put together.
For me, the biggest aha moment was realizing it's not just what happens, it's how the author tells it, using those different levels.
Absolutely. It's like they're always making these choices, like how much to tell us, when to pull back the curtain, how much to let us in on the secret. And each choice changes how we experience the whole story.
Like they're always in control, the author, kind of like a puppeteer, even when they're trying to be subtle about it.
That's a great way to put it. It's like we become more aware of their presence even when they're hiding behind the scenes, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Man, this makes me want to go back and reread all my favorite books with this new perspective.
You absolutely should. You'll be amazed by what you notice. Different authors, they all play with these levels in different ways.
Oh, I bet.
Sometimes it's all about suspense, sometimes it's about humor, sometimes it's just about messing with your head a little bit.
Yeah. Like breaking all the rules of what we think a story should be.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, this whole world of narrative levels. Any final thoughts for our listeners? What's the one thing you hope they take away from this deep dive?
Ooh, yeah, good question. What would you say?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that stories are never as simple as they seem. There's always something else going on beneath the surface. And with this idea of narrative levels, now we have the tools to understand that complexity, to really appreciate what the author is doing.
So like a whole new way to read and experience stories, right?
Exactly. So next time you find yourself getting lost in a good book or even a movie, just take a second. Ask yourself, who's telling me this story and where are they speaking from? I think you might be surprised by what you discover.
I love that. That's such a great note to end on. We're not just passive listeners anymore. We're active participants in this whole world of storytelling.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been an awesome deep dive. Until next time, everyone, happy reading. And remember, pay attention to those levels.